Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to come here and present. As you will see, my work is really quite different from what you have just seen. Let's see if I can find it. Can you find it? It's a different part of the world. It's in South Asia, it's in India. It's not a high drama of dropping bombs and things like that. It's more of a quiet, small-scale revolution on the countryside of India, perhaps. I do think, though, for the purpose of a kind of conference directed towards maybe students and so on, and thinking about development, I think the two papers are good complements in the sense that they are using, I think, what are perhaps the most dominant kind of methods used now in development economics work for extending our knowledge about things. Using more kind of historical data and clever instrumentation and things like that, as Ruben is doing. And what we are doing is an example of randomized controlled trials and lab in the field experiments, which is also kind of a dominant sort of methodological kind of branch in terms of doing development research. So, the paper then is titled Can the Poor Be Mobilized? Cooperation and Public Goods in Rural India. And this is joint work together with Raji Desai and Shareen Joshi. Is this one working? Who are both at Georgetown University. This is just a quick outline of the talk. So I'll begin with nothing strange here. I'll begin with a background, talk about the actual intervention we're looking at, look at our sort of estimations of program impact. Then I'm going to talk about some behavioral games we're playing in the field as well, and then I'll jump to conclusions. I'll try to do this relatively quickly since I'm a little bit short on time. I do my best. So what this paper is doing, in a sense, is that it's evaluating a small-scale implementation of a relatively big idea in Indian anti-poverty and rural development policy, so-called self-help groups. So self-help groups is a class of membership-based organizations that seek to basically facilitate the self-sufficiency of typically rural and marginalized participants. And as you will see in our case, this is completely targeting women, but this is not always the case, but in something like 80% of the case in India, it's targeting women exclusively. So these self-help groups are typically established by NGOs that have relatively broad kind of rural anti-poverty agendas. But the government is also, the Indian government, with the help of foreign donors, is also getting involved more recently. So now you also have state governments and so on implementing these self-help groups. So the groups themselves typically consist of something between 10 and 20 members. And a core part of the self-help group is that these members are meeting regularly to pool small amounts of money into a rotating savings fund. And then they take turns to borrow from that fund in order to invest in some kind of productive assets, or it may be in terms of health insurance if you have 6 children or something like that. But it's not really contributing a lot of resources from the outside. It's more about pooling internal resources in that sense. But the important point for this paper, perhaps in particular, is that in addition to having these rotating saving schemes, an additional purpose of these kinds of self-help groups then is in particular to encourage these members. As I said, you're typically targeting particularly vulnerable citizens in the countryside of India, in particular women, and the additional purpose then is to encourage these women to kind of empower themselves through different forms of collective actions. So the group meetings also form as an opportunity for them to discuss the problems they are facing in their household or at the village level, in terms of their ability to influence politics towards their interest, in terms of their ability to influence the quality of public service provision, for instance, which would be a core thing of what we are going to talk about. So I said this was a kind of small-scale implementation, but it's a big idea. And what I mean by the big idea is the fact that the Indian government has kind of basically determined that they want to reach as many as 150 million households, in particular in northern India, with these self-help groups. So, they really think this is a potentially effective instrument in that sense. And together with the World Bank, they have committed more than $5 billion to this case. And, $5 billion may not be huge, but when you're thinking about that, you're not really adding a lot of external money to this. Most of these money are actually just going to the administration, so you can actually reach a lot of people in that sense. However, despite this, as I said, being a relatively big idea then in Indian kind of anti-poverty work, there's very little solid evidence on the actual impact of these self-help groups. So there are some studies who are showing some potential positive effects, such as increased incomes, reduced poverty, improved women's participation in the household decision and civic engagement. Also some kind of increased self-reported trust in other villages and elected representatives and government representatives, which seem to suggest that it creates maybe some kind of social capital within these villages as well. There is also one paper that is looking explicitly at kind of collective action to rectify public service deficiencies, and they're finding some support for this. So there is some evidence in support of some positive effects. However, none of these studies are really using kind of modern methods to deal with issues of unity or program placement. And in terms of measuring things such as trust and social capital, they all rely on kind of self-reported responses rather than kind of behavioral games that are generally perceived to be perhaps better instruments to get true evaluations of these things. So in the interest of time, maybe I shouldn't mention too much about this, but it's also relevant in the context of a broader literature on so-called community-driven development projects. These are projects, so the similarity between self-help groups and sort of community-driven development projects is that in both cases, there's an attempt from an outside actor to try to organize community institutions or community groups for a common purpose. Okay? The thing with community-driven development projects, though, is that it's typically around a specific outside investment. So say that the World Bank is coming and investing in building a dam, or the Swedish SIDA is coming and they're building schools or something like that, and then they create institutions around that particular kind of investment. And the idea with the institutions is that it should create some kind of domestic ownership within the village. So village members get a chance to actually have an impact on how we're planning these investments, how we're monitoring the actual implementation of the project, and things like that. So it's really the idea that more ownership should strengthen their commitment to make this investment productive and make it work, and therefore it should work better. However, for these reasons, it also means that these types of institutions created are probably more limited in time and scope. The self-help groups are basically constructed to be there forever, right? They don't revolve around a particular type of investment, a particular type of outside action. They're supposed to be part of village life for a longer time period. Also, they are specifically targeting women and the poor and the vulnerable. In our case, so-called scheduled tribes, which are particularly sort of voiceless in terms of politics and economics in the sort of Indian villages as well. Whereas in many cases, when we talk about community-driven development projects, the kind of institutions and groups that are formed are typically kind of dominated by the existing local elite within these villages. So there are some similarities, but there are also some differences. Okay? So just in case you get bored, stop listening or something like that, as is conventional, I just give you a little bit of a breakdown of the results right away, and then you can see if you want to follow the details of how we're reaching these results as well. But basically what we're finding then, and the way this is done then is through a randomized controlled trial. So we are randomly assigning treatment of organizing these self-help groups to a certain set of villages and not to another. So when we're looking at our effects, we're comparing the results within villages where you have self-help groups and where you don't have them. Okay, and there are in particular three things we are finding in this respect with respect to the randomized controlled trial. And we're focusing here on public service provision within the area that women in Rajasthan, where this is done, are in particularly saying that this is the kind of core area of public service that they care about, which is water. And this is something that's confirmed by many other studies. And there are, in particular, as I said, three main findings to begin with. The first one is that women in these treatment villages, where you have implemented these self-help groups, tend to be better aware about where to feel water-related grievances. So they tend to be better informed about how to deal with problems with water provision. And this is not an easy thing, because it's pretty complicated who is actually responsible for these different things. So they're more likely to correctly report who to go to in case you face a problem with water provision. The other thing is that they're also more likely to actually feel such grievances. So not only are they more aware about where they should go in case they want to feel a grievance, they're also more likely to actually feel these kind of grievances to the relevant institutions in this case. So there's some kind of evidence of increased collective action in this case. And then finally, when asked about their perception about sort of the water situation, they're also more likely to have a positive view on the quality and quantity of water provision as well. So it seemed to have an actual impact on the particular public service that these women care the most about. So these are the kind of the results from the randomized controlled trial then. But these randomized controlled trials are sometimes accused of being good in terms of internal validity, of being able to establish a particular impact from some kind of intervention, but very much black box in terms of understanding why we are getting this impact. So to dig one step further, and in particular to test whether maybe these results have to do with increased social capital and cooperation and trust within these kind of communities, then we are also playing some cooperative games, or it's actually non-cooperative game theory, but it's kind of games that are trying to measure the level of cooperation and trust within these communities. And one thing that we're finding then, by playing these so-called public goods games, is that women in treatment villages on average tend to contribute more to the common good, to the public good, than women in control villages. So maybe then, provisionally, this is kind of building social capital, building trust, may be the mechanism behind the positive results we're finding in the randomized controlled trial in terms of public service provision. What are the main contributions then? Well, I think we're adding generally to the literature in development economics, which is a relatively small but growing body of evaluations that are using, not only the randomized controlled trial, but they're also taking it one step further to use these kind of lab in the field experiments to try to get at the underlying mechanism behind the impact found in the RCT studies. Secondly, then, as I said before, the self-help groups is a pretty big type of policy in India, but there's very little solid evidence in terms of its impact. So I think it's substantially an important contribution also to our understanding of the effects and the positive impact that these may potentially have. Okay, so what about the intervention then? Where are we? Well, we are in India. We are in the state of Rajasthan in western India, and we are in a district called Dungarpur in the very south of Rajasthan. Rajasthan is a relatively poor state in India. It's not the poorest, but it's one of the poorer. Dungarpur is the poorest district within Rajasthan. And in many of the villages we are working in are particularly poor. So, we are talking about a very underprivileged, environment in this case. So within Dungarpur generally, 21% are referred to as below the poverty line. So these are really very poor individuals in an absolute setting, but also in the setting of India. In our sample, only 18% of the women are actually literate. So there's very low levels of education, very low levels of income, and all these different things. We're working together with Indian grassroots movement called the Self-Employed Women's Association. So this is the actual organization then implementing this particular program on the self-help groups in this case. So this is a picture from the field. You have my colleague Shireen over here to the left taking some notes. These are some of the women that we are working with. So this is a meeting for informing women about the existence of this opportunity and so on. So as I said, and this was launched in December 2007, so this is a project that's been going on for a long time, and we've been quarreling a lot about why this took so long time, but it's the way it happens sometimes. Village selecting was done in a random way then. So based on our financial resources, the research grants we had, and based on the administrative resources that SEVA had at the time, we landed at 80 villages in total. Given constrained administrative resources, 32 of these were picked as treatment villages, and 48 were picked as control villages. And there was a random selection. First we used basically census data to make sure that these 80 villages, based on observables, are pretty similar, right? And then you make a randomized pick of these 32 treatment villages based on stratification along 3 different dimensions. First in terms of female literacy, second in terms of total number of households, and third in terms of household size. So this helps us make sure that we get a relatively balanced sample based on, typical important observables as we think it. So this is a map of our treatment and control villages. So the yellow dots here are the control villages. The black dots are our treatment villages. It may not be so easy to see here, but the red line up there is the national highway. This line over here, I guess, is the railway going through here as well. And then the other solid lines are just state or district roads. So, the reason why we're having this in here, of course, is to kind of show you that in terms of where these villages are placed, treatment and control villages in the geography, closeness to, connections and things like that, they seem to be relatively evenly distributed, okay? So as always with these randomized controlled trials, right, you start with a baseline surveys, then you do the implementation, and then after a certain amount of time, you go back and you take an online survey to look at, whether things have changed or not. So we started with a baseline survey then. We had a survey firm, professional survey firm. One advantage of working in a place like India compared to, for instance, Congo, where I'm currently having a project, is that there's a lot of professional services you can buy, which is nice. So we had a survey firm who basically mapped out the village geographically and then listed all the different households with women in the age span of 18 to 60 across the different village segments. And then they randomly picked a proportionate number to interview in these different segments. And the reason for why this is important is because Indian villages tend to be divided into areas where you have high caste and areas where you have low caste and where you have scheduled tribe and so on. So you want to have a representative sample of the kind of village population. So that was the baseline, and then the end line was conducted in the end of 2009, so it was roughly 2 years after the intervention in this case, so we gave it quite a bit of time to have an impact. And it's a repeated cross-section, so it's not a true panel in this case. So what about the intervention then? What was the intervention then? Well, it basically meant that the Self-Employed Women's Association went into the villages and started to, with the help of the village leaders and so on, to have a village-wide information campaign about the possibility for women in these ages to become members of the Self-Employed Women's Association. Okay? And as a member, and there's a member fee here of 5 rupees. So these are very poor individuals, but even for these poor individuals, 5 rupees is so low that it's not really an issue in this case. But you have to pay this nominal little fee in order to become a member. And it may help with some kind of identity feeling of being part of the group and stuff like that, I guess is the idea. And then, among those who choose to become members of the Self-Employed Women's Associations, some women also choose then to become members of these self-help groups. Okay? So you can be a member of the organization without being a member of the self-help group as well, because they're also doing some additional activities in these villages. But then, depending on how many women were signing up to become members of the self-help groups, they created groups then of 10 to 15 women. In some villages, we only have 1 self-help group. In others, we have 2 or 3 and more, depending on the number, the size of the village and the number of the women signing up. And then, these the SEVA were helping to start up these groups to begin with, having SEVA people there, helping them, elect leaders for the groups, managing these rotating saving schemes and things like that, and get the routine in place so they could, manage this by themselves later on. But basically, the idea then was that they had monthly meetings. They started with a target of saving something like 50 rupees every month and provide to this kind of common pool then that they took time to borrow from. But over time, they could also change that 50 rupees to a little bit less, 25, or they could increase it to 100 or something like that. So it was up to the group by themselves. But then, as I said, in addition to having the rotating saving scheme, SEVA was also very much encouraging these women to take the opportunity to use this time to discuss, issues important for women in these villages, actions for changing things that they perceived were bad and so on, and for taking collective action and political action.
What happens if an individual fails to contribute to the monthly meeting?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's basically a question for how they're going to work it out in the group. So in some cases, people are excluded from the group. In other cases, they find ways to work around it, and they can be included, and they may be contributing more next time and so on. But there are very few of these self-help groups, at least during the time period we have looked at it, that have actually crashed or ended in that sense. So most of them, a very wide minority of them, were still in existence in 2009. All right, so we have the baseline, we have the intervention, we have the end line, right? So we can look at the actual impact of the intervention. So membership into self-help groups is, of course, an endogenous choice. And it may very well be that the women who are, economically more successful, more social, and, more trusting, and all of these different things are more likely to become members. So we can't just, look at members and compare them with non-members in control villages, right? So we can't really measure, in a sense, the, average treatment effect on the treated in this sense. So what we're doing instead is that we're looking at the so-called intent to treat effect. So our women from treatment villages, some of them are going to be members, some of them are going to be non-members, okay? And we're looking at the average difference then from the fact that, in the treatment villages, women were given the opportunity to become members in this case. And I'm not going to, this is very standard for these RCT studies then, but we're looking at, whatever output variable we are looking at is defined at the kind of individual level, at the village level, at the block level, which is an administrative unit in Indian politics, and we also have time series variation, right? And then the key kind of variable of interest then is the interaction between the treatment indicator, whether you are a treatment village or not, and the post-intervention dummy as well. So it's the beta-free here in a sense that is measuring then the differential effect from having had the treatment on the outcome variables. That's kind of the key variable in this case. So this is just a balance table looking at differences across villages, pre and post-intervention on variables you shouldn't really expect there to be an impact. As you can see, there's basically no significant differences. So it seems like the randomization has been working out pretty much. What do we find then in terms of the results then? Well, I mean, we have a previous paper that are looking at results more broadly, but for this purpose of this paper then, we're looking more specifically at public service provision in terms of water then. And we're looking at it, as I said, along 3 main dimensions. So what impact does it have on the knowledge of women about how to deal with problems of water? Secondly, whether they take actions, and thirdly, how they perceive the water situation. Yes, Igor?
You didn't show us any comparison of water pre-treatment, kind of control group and treatment group.
Maybe not, yeah. But I mean, they are balanced as well. I think I had that maybe later on, but at least it's in the paper. So yeah. We also have that from the census as well as from our own surveys. So, but as I pointed out, we also find some positive effects on some other variables as well. But I'm not going to dwell on that now. So these first results here are basically just unconditional differences pre and post treatment in terms of pre and post treatment and in terms of these different kind of water outcomes. Okay, so this is completely unconditional. Just look at the differences in means across treatment and control villages. And if you're looking at the differences pre-treatment, yeah, this actually assesses your question, Igor, here. So here we're looking at differences in means pre-treatment in terms of overall water quality, access to piped water, and access to irrigation for farming. And there are no significant differences between them. When we're looking at the differences in mean post-treatment, all of these variables are strongly, significant. Both in terms of just, the variation over time, but also the difference in difference results are strongly significant and pointing in the direction that I was outlining before. So women in treatment villages have an increased knowledge of public authority here, and it's not, it's increased from before, right? The difference in difference effect. They're more likely to contact public officials. They are more likely to contact the sarpanch, which is the kind of local leader who is one of the persons you could contact in case you have an issue with water. And their own perceptions about the overall water quality, access to piped water, and access to irrigation for farming, all of these have been improving. Sorry, do what?
Access to piped water on average has gone down, right?
So treatment means are italicized. So treatment is bigger than.
Right. Oh. Okay.
Yep. So this is basically just showing the same thing, but here we're running regression, controlling for a bunch of observable variables. Basically, right? So you can basically see, we're controlling for age, head of household, scheduled tribes, scheduled caste, literacy, married, children, landowners, the kind of house you're living in, and so on. And even conditional on all these other kind of potential confounding factors, we do find similar results, right? One additional thing we do, just to validate a little bit our results in terms of the effect on water by some outside information, is that we actually have access to some questions that relates to water quality. In this case, it's the percent with access to treated water from the Indian census in 2011. Okay, and here this particular arm of the census was not existing in the census of 2001, so we cannot do difference in differences here. But based on all our other findings, these villages were not really that different to begin with, so we kind of have to rely on just the differences we're seeing in 2011. And once again, we see a relatively large and positive and statistically significant different effect in treatment villages relative to control villages. Okay, so how do we interpret these results from the RCT then? Well, it seemed to suggest that the intervention has had some impact on the type of public service that these women particularly care about, and that is water. Both in terms of how well informed they are about the issues, how likely they are to actually take action, and also their perception about the water situation. So, we have some impact, okay? Then the question is, why do we have this impact? And that's why we turn in the second part of the paper then to these behavioral games to try to measure the extent to which this intervention also has had an impact on cooperation and trust and social capital. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I don't want to... I'm fine. Yeah, okay.
We have 25 more.
Oh, that much. Okay, good. So the public goods games then. So, again, with very limited financial and time resources, based on the results in the RCTs, we also made an attempt to do some behavioral games in a subset of these villages then. Based on the resources we had, we managed to do this in 14 different villages then, 7 treatment villages, so 7 SEVA villages, and 7 control villages. Okay? And these were conducted in 2011, so this is almost 4 years after the initial intervention is actually taking place. So it's relatively long-run effects. But on the other hand, when it comes to creating social trust and cooperation and stuff like that, I mean, this involves norms of behavior, so this is probably something that doesn't change overnight, right? So, maybe that makes sense. You can also think about it that, if it lasts for 4 years, it seems to be more long-run sustainable as well. So the 7 treatment villages were kind of randomly picked from a set of 12 villages for which SEVA confirmed that the intervention had actually been implemented full extent and were, successful in terms not necessarily of results, but in terms of actual implementation. And then we choose the control villages basically based on a one-on-one matching, based on a set of, observable variables such as geographical proximity and similarity in terms of population size and female literacy. So we once again try to match treatment and control villages to the extent possible. And then within these different villages, women were randomly picked with the help from the Sarpanch in the control villages and mainly from SEVA member list in the treatment villages. So we were playing this. So these are very kind of, very standard types of games to be played in the lab. But I mean, in most cases, you see them being played in labs at universities, in a very kind of controlled environment, typically with university students playing them and so on. In these kind of lab in the field experiments, it's, a lot more challenging in many ways, right? So you're at the countryside in India, you don't have a lab environment in a sense. You have subjects with basically no experience with anything like this. As I said, most of them are actually illiterate and so on. So you have to be pretty creative in terms of how you actually administer these kind of games, how you make sure that they're not colluding or cooperating, how in particular you make sure that they're understanding the game structure, the incentives of the game, and how it works in a practical sense. Okay? So in this case, the public good game is basically a game where you're giving a set of money and you make a decision of how much of that money you want to keep for yourself and how much you want to provide to a common pool. Okay? And then the rule is that in this case, because this is a public good game with a so-called provision point, is that if the common pool exceeds a certain amount of money, then the money in that common pool is doubled. So we double that amount of money. And then we're handing back all that money in the common pool in equal amounts to all the women in the group. Okay? However, if the common pool do not reach the provision point, the money is basically lost. Okay? So the incentives to keep the money for yourself here are relatively strong, right? And there's a clear free rider problem. If others are providing to the common good and you exceed the provision point, that's clearly beneficial for you. Because irrespectively of whether you contributed something or not, you're going to be able to share in the common pool, right? On the other hand, if you are more cooperative in a way in your manners and in your norms, you may be more likely to contribute to the common pool, not only for the betterment of yourself, but also potentially for the betterment of others in this group, right? Yep.
Almost classical prisoner's dilemma now.
No, it's a different game, but it's a public goods game. So,
It's
yeah.
equilibrium of It's not equilibrium, but it's the most public, most
Yeah.
efficient.
Yeah, there are two. I mean, in this particular version of the game with the provision point, there are two Nash equilibria. One is where nobody contributes anything, as you were saying. But there is also, or there are two types of equilibria. The other equilibria is such that a subset of players, and this subset may involve all players, are contributing just enough to reach the threshold.
So in
But-
Prisoners Dilemma, there is no such equilibrium.
This
Yeah.
is not a prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, I mean,
And
it's,
it's very similar.
No.
Very similar.
there's some relationship to it, but it's a different class of games. But, yeah. But the reason why we are kind of, because if you're running this without a provision point, then the only Nash equilibrium is that nobody contributes anything. But by including this provision point, first of all, studies have shown that by doing that, you actually elicit actual true valuations of these things in a better way. But it also, in this case, kind of creates a focal point for these women to think about what cooperative behavior means, if it kind of means that everybody contributes at least up to that point. But then, of course, I mean, when we're talking about Nash equilibria, we're talking about rational behavior. And as my ambassador was pointing out before, we know from experiments and so on that people are not necessarily reacting this way. I mean, they generally tend to be more generous. And this is true in Indian villages as much as it is in US colleges, or even more, as it turns out, according to our evidence and so on. But anyway, so that's a little bit, the underlying theory behind it. In terms of, how we do it in a practical way, then, is that we're basically giving these women two envelopes. We have one big envelope where they get 7 different coupons that are representing denominations of 10 rupees, 5 rupees, and 1 rupees. Okay? And together these, can add up to 20 rupees then. And then they get a small envelope where they put their own contributions. So we give them 20 rupees. We ask them, how much do you want to give to the common pool? They make a decision and they put that amount of money in the small envelope. Okay?
Coupons, not real money.
They are, informed about that at the end of the game, these coupons are translated into real money. So they know that, yeah.
What is this change rate? The change rate of rupee to USD?
Oh, it varies. But I mean, this is a significant amount of money. So I think on average, I mean, how much you're actually making from this depends on how successful you are, right, and your strategies. But on average, the payoff corresponds to something like 1.5 days of labor income in a village like this. So it's not an insignificant amount of money for these women. So, yes.
What threshold do you use, actually? I mean, how much they should submit?
Yeah, I'll get to that, exactly. So, when you're doing these lab and field experiments, it's of course important, first of all, that you're clear in explaining the rules of the games, and that in particular in lab and field experiments, that you can explain it in a way that makes sense for local people. So Shireen here, helped us, both language-wise and all of these different things in terms of local knowledge, of being able to communicate this in a way that we think were relatively successful in get them to understand, what the incentives they were actually facing. And it's of course also important that you make sure that you are telling the story in a consistent way across the different villages as well. So it's important that it's the same person who's running the games all the time as well. Well, this is basically an illustration of the stage game then. This was actually repeated several times. They didn't know that, but we did repeat it. But as I said, you get 20 rupees. You make the decision how much you want to keep for yourself, how much you want to add to the common pool. The money added to the common pool is collected, and it's we're adding up and summing up how much people jointly are adding. And if that contribution is exceeding the threshold, then we are multiplying that by 2 and we're handing it back to everybody in equal amounts. If it's not exceeding the threshold, that money is lost, and you only get to keep the money you kept for yourself. So as I said, players are not informed in advance, but we repeat the game, which kind of allows for learning. So in a sense, the very first round of the game is the cleanest way to measure actual, cooperation or trust and so on, since in the repeated, you also learn something about the strategies of the others as well. And the provision points, get into your question there, the provision point starts at n times 10. So if we have 10 women in the group, the provision point is 100. So that if everybody gives 10, or 10 on average, we're exceeding the threshold. And then what we do is that, whenever the threshold has been met, we increase the threshold by 20%. And then we stop the game, since it's a repeated game, we stop the game either after 10 rounds or whenever the provision point goes beyond n minus 1 times 20. Okay. Yeah.
Do they know what is the threshold, or?
Yes, you are informed about what the threshold is, exactly.
And then they can talk to each other.
No, they're informed not to communicate or talk to each other. So they are separated, and they are told, they are definitely told not to, make common decisions. They have to make the decisions individually and without communicating. Yeah. But that's the idea, right? Because otherwise they can just collude on saying, let's all give everything. And, yeah.
So just to understand, here you cannot separate the effect of learning from the effect of raising the threshold, right? Because they're always coming to the same.
I mean, the learning here I'm thinking about is more in terms of learning about how others seem to be playing, how cooperated they seem to be.
Yes, but theoretically, their behavior can change for both reasons. Like you raise threshold,
Yeah.
you do,
So when we run, yeah.
also change them, and you cannot separate.
So when we're running our regressions, when we're looking at the kind of conditional effects, we are controlling both for the round of the game and we're controlling for the size of the threshold. Because the size of the threshold may be different in different villages, right, for different rounds. You see what I'm saying?
No, because it's
So if in one village,
you've written like the exact formula for threshold. Now you say that I probably don't get something.
no, but if you look at two villages, in the first village you meet the threshold in the first round.
Yeah.
Then the threshold for the second game is increased by 20%. In the other village, you don't reach the first threshold.
Oh, successful completion.
Yeah.
Successful is what if you reach the threshold.
Yeah, yeah.
Ah, okay.
So then it's not, yeah. So what do we expect to find then? Well, I mean, the way we are arguing then is that we do expect women in treatment villages then to contribute more. And then, as I said, in particular in the first round, where we most cleanly are measuring this sort of impact on cooperation. And our argument for why do we think then that these self-help groups should make these women, I mean, think about it. I mean, the incentives of you to contribute to the pool is going to be critically depending on whether you think the other women in the room are going to contribute to the pool, right? If you think that nobody else is going to contribute, for sure you're not going to be willing to contribute, right? Because you're not going to reach the threshold. But if you think that everybody else are contributing, you may, as a norm, want to contribute yourself, even though in principle, by being a free rider, you can benefit from not doing it. Unless you happen to be the pivotal person, who makes you reach the equilibrium, right, in that case. So generally, I mean, your willingness to contribute is going to be a function of whether you trust or believe that other women in the group or in the room are going to contribute to the common pool or not. And then the argument we are making is that if we think about these self-help groups and what they are doing, they're meeting on a regular basis, they rely on our rotating saving schemes, and these rotating saving schemes in themselves rely on you trusting the other women in these groups. Because if they start bailing out, once it's your turn to borrow the money, everybody are gone, you have only lost from participating in this case. So if you have, been a member of these groups for, several years, you probably have managed to create a certain trust and level of cooperation among yourself and among women in the group. And in addition to the actual savings scheme and so on, you also get just an opportunity to meet regularly, to discuss things you care about, and all these different things, which can create social bonds and all of these different things. Yes?
I was wondering how big these villages are, and if the women in the control groups, whether they see each other. They see their faces. I understand.
Yeah, you see the other people in the room, so you know who else are in the room. And they are of comparable size. I mean, I probably have the statistics here, but treatment and control villages are of comparative sizes at least. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller.
Bigger, I mean, hundreds of people or
Yeah.
thousands of people?
Yeah. I think none is below 100, I think, and none is above 1,000. So it's kind of in that range. I mean, I can look it up, and it's in the paper, but yeah. Okay? So, this is kind of the theoretical argument for why we think membership in this kind of group could have an impact on social cooperation and trust and so on. This is just, again, a balance table. I mean, we had a balance table before for the RCT. This is a balance table for the games. So we can basically see along the dimensions on which we're collecting data, such as age, education, literacy, and so on, except for whether they live with a husband. There are no significant differences in means across treatment and control village women. Then. So key results then. So these are the game results. So to the left, you see the results of the first round, where I said that you most cleanly, in a sense, capture the effect of social capital. That's the general argument, before learning kicks in and so on. The blue line, it's a sheer coincidence that these are the colors of the Swedish flag, of course. It's Ukraine. Yeah. And as you can see, for the first round, the blue bar are treatment. Is treatment, and the yellow bar is control. And as you can see, the mean contribution per round, in the first round then, for women in treatment villages, is something like 12, I guess, whereas for women in control villages, it's more like 8. So it's a relatively large, in economic terms, difference, and it's statistically significant as well. Once you look at the subsequent rounds, where you also have some learning, you see that, for both treatment and control villages, cooperation actually goes up. When you're playing these games with students, at least my experience, when you're playing these games with students in the US, it's kind of the other way around. Cooperation actually goes down. But here, actually, cooperation goes up. So it seems like more, women have internalized norms about if others are generous, I should be generous, at the general level. But then, of course, there can also be differences depending on the intervention as well. And again, you see in the subsequent rounds, the difference is smaller, but it's still there, and it's still statistically significant, though a little bit more on the margin. This is basically showing a very similar thing, but looking at it, at the time dimension, where we have, the rounds over here, and we have the average contribution on the left-hand side. Again, those were only kind of unconditional means, right? These are the conditional effects when we are controlling for a bunch of different things. In this case, we're also having relatively few villages, right? And we need to cluster the data at the village level and so on. Because of the small number of clusters, we need to make some corrections, some small cluster adjustments to the standard errors, doing a bunch of different things, cluster robust standard errors, bias reduced linearization, wild bootstrap T, and things like that. And throughout all of these different kind of ways of sensitivity analysis, the results stay the same. Focusing in particular on contribution, which I think is the most important thing, women in Seva villages tend to spend more money. Another somewhat interesting finding is that when we're also looking at the net earnings from the previous round, we find that for Seva women, the interaction between Seva village and net earnings in the previous round is positive, suggesting that if you were making money out of sort of free riding, because in this case it's always the case that by contributing less, you're making more money, in a sense. So if you were making more money in the previous round, you were contributing less. And if you look in controlled villages, in this case, if they made more money in the previous time period, they're contributing less in the next period. So their learning is kind of that, I actually benefited from contributing less, so I'm going to, keep on contributing less. But in the treatment villages, the effect is actually the opposite. So if they were making more in the previous time period, because they were contributing less in a sense, they're actually contributing more in the next period. So it seems like they want to abide by what they perceive as the social norm of other people being more generous. So I should probably be more generous, not only thinking about my own benefit in that sense, in a kind of natural and rational ways. So again, some support for the idea that maybe there's some internalization of more cooperative norms in that sense. So conclusions then. I started out, talking about, can the poor be organized from the outside in a sense? I mean, there is a big, I haven't really talked about that, but there is a big debate about, whether outsiders like NGOs and so on can come into villages and organize the poor for different purposes. In this case, the kind of village institutions we're talking about could in principle be organized, endogenously within the village without any kind of, outside influence in a sense, because these do not rely on a lot of capital from the outside that we're building stuff or anything like that. So in principle, if these institutions are useful for these women, why haven't they already organized them in the villages? So why should we then think if someone comes from the outside and organizing these things that they could make a difference and that they could be sustainable and all these different things? But what we find is that, yes, it seems actually, at least in this particular case, to be working. The outside groups coming and helping to organize these things. Of course, they're contributing with some knowledge and some authority and so on. Maybe they can overcome some resistance from the men in the village and giving, the women allowance to actually contribute and participate in these kind of groups. But anyway, I mean, just to sum up the results again, we do find that women in treatment villages where we have these self-help groups are more likely to be informed about how to deal with water problems, more likely to take action to deal with water problems, and are also more favorable in terms of their perceptions about the water situation. And finally, in terms of trying to get that, the behavioral aspect of this, of why this is happening, what's the mechanism, we do find some support for the idea that women in treatment villages are more cooperative. They show a little bit more of trust and so on, and social capital. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Yep. There's a question there in the back. Yeah, I think you're getting it.
My question is, if I understood the game scheme correctly, there are not just 2 rounds, but many rounds, and every time the threshold needed increases by 20%. So theoretically, on the 10th time or 11th time, it would be impossible to get this payback, even if all the women give all the money. So why do they actually? It's interesting where at which point they actually stop giving or understand that there is no logic to give anymore because we cannot get this payback, or I did not get it right.
No, what I said, and I'm trying to, nothing happens.
Because there was information about the second round, but nothing about the third and fourth and fifth, if there were.
Okay, good. Yeah, so here you see over here. So the game stops either after 10 rounds or when the provision point goes beyond n times 1 times 20. And that's exactly because once it goes beyond that, you can't increase it by 20% again because then you're extending the limit. Okay? But since it's only increased with successful completion, it means that in principle you can do this with 10 periods. None of these periods you are actually contributing up to the threshold, so you stay at that threshold, and then we're ending it at 10.
But they get new money every round.
Yeah, they get new money every round for sure.
So they want to have more rounds.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason why we're not. I mean, first of all, I think we're expecting a little bit too much rationality of these women if we're thinking this. But from a theoretical perspective, this is one reason why we're not telling them. We're just telling them we're going to play this game. This is what happened. Okay, now we're going to play it again. We're not telling them the rules for how many times or when it stopped. But you're right. If they knew this and were fully rational, of course they would make sure that they're playing this for 10 rounds. Yes.
I don't know if I understand well, but in the case of the randomized control trial, you have different. Can you?
I think I can hear you. I think we can hear you anyway. So.
Everybody can hear.
Yeah.
You have different villages and you have different groups, and if I understand it well, you have groups, and then the effect is the effect of the village.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, shouldn't the effects that you observe, the differences that you observe, be bigger for smaller villages, where the effect actually of providing these groups for women should be, in terms of kind of proportion, bigger? If you observe differences between different villages.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if a larger share of the women, I guess, I mean, it could be that even if it's a smaller village, the same share of women are in there. But you're right. I mean, in principle, since it's intention to treat effects, and we think there may be some spillovers, that's what we expect, but we should definitely think the effect is stronger on those who are actual members. So if you have a larger share of members, you should expect a bigger effect. That's a good point. I haven't looked at that.
It's also especially important because you say that you have these thresholds in the trust game, and you talk about cooperative behavior, and basically it it seems to me that you are suggesting that if enough people complain about the water, maybe public authorities will do something about it. In a very large village, 20 women complaining, which is the maximum that you can have in the size, probably wouldn't make a big difference. But in a village of 100 people, this is why I was interested in the size of the village, maybe they make a very big impact. So this is also why I think it might be interesting.
Yeah, I think it can go in different directions. In terms of the effect of complaining, I'm not sure that it's the share of women in a village who go and complain that makes a difference. From the perspective of the Sarpanch or the people at the collector's office who are responsible, they may get, the number of people showing up in his office may be, what makes him more concerned or makes him more likely. And then, of course, in a bigger village, even if it's a smaller share, maybe it has more of an impact. So, I agree with that, there may be heterogeneity in the effects depending on the sizes of the village in that sense, but I'm not entirely sure how it goes, in what direction it goes. But, it's a good point. We could potentially check for, heterogeneous impact conditional on size, yeah. Yes?
I want to go back to the diversity part.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand how organizing their self-help groups increases access to pipe water. I thought access to pipe water depends on the infrastructure, like whether there are pipes or not. How does self-help group help? And then the second question is, you spend that much money organizing the self-help groups, and you get some positive effects. So could you give the back of the envelope calculation on the benefits of this program? Like, is it worth it scaling it for the whole year or something?
Yeah, in terms of the first part, there's two parts to piped water. The first one is to have the infrastructure, the other one is the infrastructure is working. In many cases, it's that the infrastructure is not working and the people who are responsible for fixing them are not coming. So the argument, and the kind of change of logic we would argue then is that, by having these self-help groups, helping women overcome the general public goods problem in terms of, basically going and complaining about these things, because it is, it's a public good issue, to have people going and taking the effort and time to go to collector's office and complain about these things for the village. By facilitating collaboration and trust among these women, they're more likely to actually engage in that. So that's why, we're looking not only at the effects, we're looking at whether they're informed about it and whether they take action. So the idea is that, it makes them more likely to take action. And once they take action, and remember, we have 2 years between the baseline intervention and the end line. So there's both time for people to go out and actually build pipes and to fix broken pipes and so on. So there could be effects in that sense as well. What was the second part?
Is it worth it?
Yeah, this is, of course, a very relevant question for all policy purposes. It's also a very difficult question to respond to. But what I could say, we said, there's a substantial amount being spent here, it's $5 billion. But on the other hand, that's with the ambition of reaching 150 million households. And in terms, so this is definitely not a costly type of intervention. If you look at the CDD, the Community-Driven Development Programs, only the World Bank has spent more than $50 billion on CDD programs, who are reaching, not only in India, but other parts of the world as well. But in terms of the number of people they're reaching, it's definitely much, much smaller. So it's definitely a low-cost intervention. If it's a cost-efficient intervention, I wish I could do some serious look at that, but I don't really have the necessary data to be able to answer that. But it's a very relevant question. Yeah, Ruben.
So in the trust game, if I understood correctly,
yeah.
You have a randomly picked women to participate. So by randomly, some of them will be coming from the self-help groups, and some not.
Yeah.
And there should be some random variation in that, in the composition of the groups. Do you see any heterogeneity? Because it tells you a lot about the mechanism. Are there any spillovers to other women in the villages?
Yeah, it's not completely balanced. There are more women who are members than are non-members. When we're looking at the differences across members and non-members in treatment villages, we find that members are more cooperative than non-members, in particular in the first round. And then the non-members are, learning something from the behavior of the members, and they're basically contributing to the same amount in the coming rounds. But there's a selection issue, right? Maybe those who chose to become members to begin with are different from those who did not choose to become members in terms of the level of trust and so on. So it's a little difficult to for sure say, what.
If you treat the group outcome as an outcome, like average it on the group, and look at the share of women from the self-help group, that is random because it's just like you accidentally pick, right?
Yeah, but I mean, they may be different, right?
It depends on the sampling, how you sample people from the village.
But it's an endogenous choice to become a member, right, to begin with. And those people may be different.
For individual, it is endogenous.
Yeah.
The share of the treated people, if I understood correctly, maybe I'm wrong.
Are you looking at the variation across these 7 villages in the shares?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's just so small sample, I think. But one thing that we did do was that we were also running some propensity score matching models, trying to predict, based on observables, who become members and not, both in treatment and in control villages. And then we separated them into high and low probability in both types of villages. And then we kind of, looked at the difference in behavior for likely members in treatment villages and likely members in control villages, and unlikely members in treatment villages and unlikely members in control villages. And when we're looking at those differences as well, we find the similar differences. So, even those who are kind of are likely to have become members if SEVA had gone into those control villages, even there you see a significant difference of a similar size. We were also looking at, trying to measure under the assumption that this is a purely selection effect. Then, there are ways to try to measure how big that selection effect is in order to, give you this result. And, I don't fully understand how to interpret those things. But at least compared to what others have been doing and so on, it's clear that you have to assume a very, very, very strong selection effect into becoming a member in order for this to be completely kind of explained by that. So, yes.
I didn't come to an end of the presentation, but I refer to the last slide in the handout.
Yeah, that was if, yeah.
And among others, you mentioned greater bargaining power within family over family decisions. And perhaps it's not something I would expect with the type of intervention you do, also because there is empirical evidence that the distribution of bargaining power is very resistant, and even if there are small changes, it tends to set back in a way. So I wonder which family decisions are involved here. Or how do you judge about the change in the distribution of bargaining power?
I mean, we find that along at least 3 different dimensions, and I have it in the paper. I can look it up later on. But I mean, to me, it's, as you say, there's mixed evidence in terms of this. I mean, some interventions have an impact, some interventions do not have an impact. I mean, in this case, I find it could potentially have to do with at least 2 things. One is that the women are actually getting an additional way of making some investments into productive activities. So it may have an impact on, the relative share of income coming to the woman, which may have an impact. It may also be that, as I said, part of the things that they're talking about and collectively dealing with are, things happening within the household, such as domestic violence, such as drinking. There are some of these self-help groups who have been organized in southern India have very much focused on, women dealing with men who are drinking and being abusive. So that's very much the purpose of that. And there, by having other women in the group coming with you to the household and confronting your husband when he's drunk and beating you up, it may be a way of helping you for the future. So those are potential ways I can think that it may make a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you.